Well, thank you, Paige, and for everyone attending today. Thank you for joining us. Today's curriculum is Reserve Studies 103. So we are here to help you figure out your reserve funding plan. And as we show you, it's a financial journey with some things out of your control and some things in your control. You're the one that needs to make properly sized reserve transfers in order to prepare for those large upcoming reserve projects so you can get those projects accomplished on time. Doing your reserve projects on time will minimize the extra costs that come from deferred maintenance. Reserve projects are already expensive enough. Having the cash on hand to do those reserve projects on time will also maximize owner pride of ownership, and also it'll maximize property values. So today we'll show you how to make those wise decisions. This is the outline we're going to use today to talk about reserve funding. At its simplest, it's just the cash necessary to offset ongoing deterioration. A hotel charges a daily rate, so the funds exist so that re-roofing, recarpeting, and repainting all get done on schedule without having to special assess unlucky guests checking in the week that the carpeting needs to be replaced. And it's the same everywhere else. Rental cars, apartments, health clubs, they all collect enough funds on an ongoing basis to sustain their assets. You should likewise be budgeting to collect sufficient cash to do all your scheduled reserve projects in a timely manner. And today we're going to help you see how that's done. Reserves are important because if you have buildings or assets, even just gates or a tot lot, you have reserve expenses. Everything deteriorates. And reserve expenses are by definition too big to absorb into the ongoing operational budget. Typically, they're huge. Our job as a reserve study provider is to guide you so that you know how much to set aside. So when the time comes to perform the project, the funds exist. And this means funding on an ongoing basis while your components gradually deteriorate. Now, the first thing Brian and I are going to start you out with today is a pro tip, making it clear that ongoing reserve funding is not an additional cost, making life at the association more expensive. That's because the roof is going to fail, likely right on schedule. It will be expensive. Your choice is if the homeowners at your association pay a little bit per month over the 20 years or so the roof serves the association, or all at once in a special assessment when the roof fails. It's the same cost either way. Either way, the owners pay the roof bill. It's only a choice of how they pay the roof bill. It's fiscally responsible to tell your owners the true cost of ownership along the way, like a hotel does, rather than bumping along from one unwanted and unfair special assessment to another, giving your owners false and unrealistic expectations for what it costs to live at the association. Doing so is just going to set them up to complain, as they should, each time there is a special assessment for a predictable expense. That should have been budgeted. So why not just have them pay the true cost of ownership on an ongoing basis so you can run a smooth financial operation? And that's one thing you might notice, that today Brian and I call them reserve funding obligations or a reserve funding recommendation. We don't call them contributions. There's nothing optional about reserve funding. Your assets are deteriorating, and the board is responsible to budget to maintain the assets of the association. Just like you have a water bill or a management bill each month, the roof and the asphalt all are deteriorating each month. Those deterioration bills are bills just like every other bill that you need to pay. They're real. If you ignore them, they don't go away. They just accumulate. So, what are we shooting for? What are we trying to accomplish today? It's important to start with the big picture. The board is responsible to maintain the property, the common areas, and that's usually clearly stated in the governing documents. Doing that yields owner enjoyment and maximized property values, and both of those are very good things. National Reserve Study standards guide us down this path, clearly stating the 4 funding principles to follow in creating a reserve funding plan. As you can see, we're supposed to create a plan with sufficient cash to do all the required projects on time, budget stability from year to year so your owners have an accurate expectation for what it costs to live in and own in the association, an equitable distribution over the owners over the years, so everyone's paying their fair share, and fundamentally a plan that is fiscally responsible. If we were to look around, the most common reserve funding goal in the country is either minimizing assessments or doing what we did last year. But those things really don't get you to the future. Power bills go up. Janitorial and landscaping services just get more expensive. Insurance, as you know, is going way up. And just like those other costs, roof replacements, carpet replacements, fence replacement, all those things are all getting more expensive. Inflation is real, and you should expect your homeowner assessments need to go up. At your association, you are a nonprofit, okay? The assessments are there to pay the bills. There's no profit involved, so set them appropriately. So, Brian, we're going to turn the microphone over to you. What affects the size of our reserve funding recommendations?
Thanks, Robert. Glad to be here with you and our audience today. We're here to talk about how much is required to fund reserves at your association. The amount may seem like a lot, but roofing is expensive. Asphalt is expensive. Elevators are expensive. Really, the key to minimizing your reserve funding needs is to spread them out nice and thin over time. There are 4 factors affecting the size of your reserve funding recommendation. First is the components, the physical assets you're responsible for maintaining. Some associations have more, some have less. This is custom to each association. If you missed it, we did actually discuss reserve components in detail in our Reserve Studies 101 webinar. That webinar is available on our website and YouTube. Second is your starting point, the size of your reserve fund. At this time, is your reserve fund strong? Is it fair? Or is it weak? Basically, are you in a good position just keeping up with ongoing deterioration? Or are you starting way behind, having a lot of catch-up work to do in order to prepare for upcoming expenses? We cover reserve fund strength and how it's calculated in our Reserve Studies 102 webinar. Again, if you missed it, you can find it on our website or YouTube. Third is how much margin for the unexpected is right for your association. Basically, this amounts to how much you actually hate special assessments at your association and how much of a cash cushion you want to maintain. And fourth is the mathematical calculation tool used for crafting the funding plan. There are 2, the component method and the cash flow method. And making a wise choice is very important. I'll spend most of my time today on numbers 3 and 4 because those are the only ones where you have choices to make. You're stuck with the components you have at your association and with the reserve fund strength left to you by prior boards. But you do have choices when it comes to numbers 3 and 4. I want to talk briefly about reserve components. The first on my list. You may have a pool, roof, asphalt, or other components. Or you may not. Your association has a list of reserve components the association is responsible to maintain. As a board or manager, they are your common area repair and replacement responsibility. If you ignore them, owners get dissatisfied and you increase your liability exposure. Besides, curb appeal is real. Caring for the common elements also maximizes home values. In comparison, the cost of reserve funding will look small. And just like with components, I'll briefly address the effect of your starting reserve fund strength. Reserve fund strength is your starting point. So today is Wednesday. If you need to drive to New York City by the end of the week, the Red Star, it would be nice to start somewhere close, like the Blue Dot in Boston. It's a bit more of a challenge if you're starting from somewhere a bit farther away, like Myrtle Beach. Now you realize the farther away you are, the more you have to plan ahead. Getting to New York City is going to be a bigger challenge if you're starting in Dallas or even farther away in Los Angeles. Remember, your reserve components are all deteriorating and your roof is going to fail. It's in your best interest to be financially prepared, close to having enough funds. If you are starting out from far behind, or in this case of the map, a long way off, it means you're going to have to hustle to build your reserve fund in time to have the cash to perform your upcoming projects. So now we can talk about things where you have some control and ability to affect the results. Typically, your reserve study professional will have a recommendation for your association about how much margin is appropriate, because things rarely happen exactly according to the plan. Here, I'm showing a set of reserve expenses scattered through the years. You want a funding plan that will provide enough cash for these expenses, like this blue line, always a little more than the expenses. This will allow you to do your reserve projects on schedule. But because nothing ever happens exactly according to the plan, it is a good idea to have a little margin in your plan, like this green line. The majority of your reserve funding goes straight to the expenses, but a little margin can go a long way to making life smoother at your association. So, how much margin is good? Let me show you what it looks like to have no margin. This chart shows an association pursuing baseline funding, a plan where at some future point in time, your reserve balance will fall close to zero, just barely cash positive. They technically have enough cash to do all their projects, but they have one or more pinch point years where reserve cash is near zero. And that's when the association risks a special assessment if things don't go exactly according to the plan. Fortunately, National Reserve Study Standards define 3 funding goals: baseline, which is what I just showed you; threshold, which is a chosen dollar or percent funded amount that you want to stay above; or full funding, which means the goal of having cash on hand equivalent to your amount of deterioration. Here's what it means to your association. When you are baseline funding your association, your reserve fund will approach zero cash or 0% funded for a few years surrounding your pinch point. That's the red zone on the left of this chart. In those years, statistically speaking, you have around a 50% chance of needing a special assessment because of insufficient cash on hand. Let's say you chose a threshold value of a dollar amount, or its equivalent as a percent funded amount. Let's choose 50% funded just to illustrate. That's the yellow range in the middle of this chart. Staying above 50% funded means you'll have a high risk of special assessment down around 10%. That's pretty good. Having the additional margin in your reserve fund, a little bit more cash on hand, has significantly dropped your risk of a special assessment. And then there's full funding, our normal recommendation at association reserves. That's the green zone on the right. Not only is it an easily defensible goal because your reserve fund is the same size as the dollar value of what's deteriorated at your association, it also means your special assessment risk is close to zero. That means associations pursuing a full funding goal can basically avoid special assessments. And the good thing is that your margin choices aren't a big deal when it comes to the size of your reserve funding recommendations. Looking at our clients, the difference in reserve funding between what it takes to pursue just baseline funding and full funding is about 10 to 20%. Not a big difference in the size of your reserve transfers. Remember, most of your reserve cash gets spent on reserve projects, and there's a real benefit. Dropping the risk of special assessments from about 50% when you're near the pinch year to almost zero. That's peace of mind for your homeowners. And that brings us to the last topic, the method used to calculate the funding requirements. Like before, we're presuming the component expenses are set. This is just a discussion about the method used to calculate reserve funding needs. With reserves, the choice of the mathematical tool makes a big difference in the results. Typically, this choice is made by a reserve study professional, selecting what's best for your association. And for most associations, without specific legislation dictating otherwise, the choice is clear. Between the component method, also called straight line, and the cash flow method, also called pooled, the cash flow method is the clear winner. Very simply, it is more flexible and more advantageous to the association. The funding profile over the years can be crafted to maximize smoothness and fairness to the owners. And it is also easily adjusted to provide more or less funding margin, as I spoke about a few moments ago. So why would anyone use the component method? This topic is significant primarily to associations where state law points associations in this direction. This is also significant for individuals building their own reserve funding plans on a spreadsheet, because the component method is very simple. Just do a calculation for each component one at a time. That's the key, and sum it at the bottom of the list. So the component method is kind of an up and down way to calculate your reserve funding requirements. I'll explain it this way. Let's take the second component from the list, pool resurfacing, a $10,000 project that needs to be done every 10 years. With that in mind, when the pool is new and without complicating this illustration with interest or inflation, you have 10 years to collect $10,000. So your reserve funding requirements are $10,000 divided by 10 years or $1,000 a year. It's pretty simple. If the association doesn't make all its budgeted reserve transfers and gets to the 5-year-old point and only has $2,500 set aside instead of $5,000, then the association has 5 years to fund the remaining $7,500 needed to prepare for this $10,000 expense. That's $7,500 over 5 years. So now the reserve funding needs for this component are $1,500 a year. In other words, getting a little behind on reserve funding has made the reserve funding requirement for the remaining years 50% higher. They're clearly in catch-up mode. Now let's let the association get a few more years down the road, and let's say they're way behind on the reserve funding. Remember talking about the importance of your starting point a few minutes ago. This means that they don't have much time, but they're financially far away from being prepared. On a side note, this is the state of most associations, unfortunately. So let's say they're at the 8-year-old point with only $6,000 set aside. That means they need to collect the remaining $4,000 in the last 2 years, or $2,000 a year. Their reserve funding needs calculate to be twice what they would have needed to collect if they'd been setting aside reserves responsibly through the years. But let's say they are able to collect the necessary funds so the project gets done. Then their cycle is reset all over again, and they're back to having 10 years to collect the next $10,000 to replace it again. That, of course, means the reserve funding needs for this component drop back down to $1,000 a year again. This is an opportunity for the board to enjoy learning from their reserve funding requirements. This little example illustrates the problems with the component method of funding, where boards find that if they get behind, the funding requirement begins to climb pretty steeply, but it drops down again right after the expense when you have a useful life cycle to prepare for the next project. Funding plans calculated with the component method, remember, many people call it the straight line method, where each component's reserve funding requirement is calculated separately, tend to be high in the first few years, dropping as a project gets accomplished. Remember this chart from a few minutes ago where I talked about looking at expenses and the value of some margin? This is what happens in the cash flow method. Expenses are projected throughout the years without consideration for what each year's reserve expenses are made up of, whether it's roofing, painting, asphalt, elevators, carpets, or whatever. Just expenses. Then you develop a smooth, multi-year funding plan looking at expenses projected out over the years, left to right, that provides sufficient margin pursuing the chosen goal. So while the component method is up and down, the cash flow method deals with exactly the same expenses, just looking at them right to left. From left to right. And when you do that, you can create a funding plan that is smooth over the years, gradually floating upwards with inflation. If you remember the 4 funding principles Robert showed at the beginning, this type of funding plan very nicely meets the equitable distribution funding principle. This is possible because with the cash flow method, each individual component does not need to be funded separately from the others. Your focus is on an annual cash need, not individual component needs. In the cash flow method, all expenses share one reserve fund, so there's never a rush in the last few years of a component's life. Reserve income and reserve expenses are smoothly balanced through the years because all the reserve funding goes into the pool and all the expenditures come out from that same pool. There's no rushing. There's total sharing. This means funds can be used more efficiently than being divided up in all those separate different accounts, one for each component. So when I show them side by side, it's pretty clear. The same net funds go to reserves over the years. It's just that the cash flow method doesn't force associations to pay a steep price in the first few years to rapidly resolve any underfunding. So in either method, the same total amount goes into the reserves, but the cash flow method is and will always be a more efficient use of an association's reserves and will always be more favorable to the vast majority of associations in the country that find themselves at least somewhat underfunded. The cash flow method makes life in an underfunded association so much more palatable. What's important to note is that the initial year funding requirements calculated with the component method are regularly about twice as much as funding requirements calculated by the cash flow method. That's why we so clearly state that it's best to avoid the component method. Reserve professionals across the country avoid it. So if you're calculating your own reserve funding requirements by the component method, where each component's reserve needs are funded individually, please stop. Hire a reserve study professional and let them create a smoother funding profile for your association using cash flow methodology that doesn't punish your homeowner so severely in the first few years of the plan.
Well, thanks, Brian. That was a great job of explaining funding plans without asking anyone to pull out a calculator. I got kind of distracted just listening and just absorbing it and thinking, what a great way of explaining it all. At this point in time, looking at the clock and the material, let me spend just a couple minutes drawing this program to conclusion. This is all we do, day after day, guiding our board and manager clients down the trail towards the future, recommending funding plans that answer the question, what do I do now? And having an association reserves project manager on your team means you have someone familiar with the tools, methods, and influencing factors, someone who sees the multi-year perspective and someone who can design a funding plan that's just right for your association. Remember, deterioration is real and ongoing. There's nothing you can do to stop it. The ongoing deterioration of the components you are responsible to maintain and your starting reserve cash balance define your reserve funding starting point. And from there, you have some flexibility with how much margin you and your reserve professional will select or which funding method is best for your association. But that combination of components, the starting point, the amount of margin, and funding methodology all mean that the funding for one association might be very different from another physically similar association. There's no magic solution to lowering your reserve funding needs. Deterioration is real and expensive. The best thing you can do, like Brian said at the start, is to spread them out nice and thin and evenly over as many years as possible. If you're not funding your reserves adequately, you'll soon run your association right into an unwelcome trip to what we call special assessment land. And in the big picture, looking at funding data from thousands of clients in all 50 states, most associations need to plan on setting aside between 15 and 40% of their total budget towards reserves. Many associations find their just right amount of reserve funding to be pretty close to 25% of their total budget. It's a pretty easy number to remember. And although that might seem like a big number, I'll argue that reserve funding is not too expensive. For one reason, it's the cost of home ownership. You can't avoid a roof failing. So for the average condo owner, it boils down to just a few dollars per day. And that's about the cost of a premium cup of coffee. And remember, that little bit more per day or per month doesn't increase the homeowner's cost of ownership. It just means that the homeowners are paying the true cost of home ownership at the association on an ongoing basis instead of with a catch-up special assessment every few years. So to bookend this presentation, I'll end with another pro tip for you at your next board or budget meeting when you're discussing reserve funding. When you do that, when you're discussing reserve funding, don't describe it as contributions or for the future. That makes it sound like something you can defer, a problem someone else in the future should address, or something that's optional. When you discuss reserve funding, remember, it's a bill just like any other bill. Reserve funding pays the deterioration bill. It's part of the true cost of homeownership in your association. It's not a bill that you can make go away. So just remember what you're trying to accomplish: paying for the predictable needs of your association in a stable, fair way so that you can maintain the property and maximize property values. And when you do that as a board member, you keep your liability exposure to a minimum. I want to personally thank you for joining us today for this webinar and point you to a few additional resources. If you go to our website, reservestudy.com, you'll find a deep library of written and video resources under our Resources tab. And on our website, on our homepage, if you'd like us to help your association, by all means scroll to the top right where you'll find a little button to request a proposal. And if you search for our reserve study videos or any reserve study videos on YouTube, you'll likely find ours, and consider them your favorites. Give them a like and subscribe to our channel. Or if you're the kind of person who likes something a little more tangible, something that you want on your desk or a bookcase, or something that stays with the association library of resources, we've got a book that summarizes the major reserve study concepts that we talked about today: funding, components, things like that. And so consider ordering our book, Understanding Reserves. Now, you can download Chapter 1 for free from our website. And I'll include a link to that in the outline that we prepare. And if you like what you see, it's easy to get a copy by just ordering from Amazon. It's pretty inexpensive. And something that might be a great resource for people attending this webinar specifically is our online reserve calculator called UPlanet. It allows you to test different funding plans and different expenses so you can see if you like what happens, and you can make informed adjustments to your professional reserve recommendation. It's all cash flow methodology, so it's an optimum tool for your association. Access is free with every professional reserve study from Association Reserves. And we have one final resource. We've got a weekly podcast for board members called HOA Insights, Common Sense for Common Areas. We have a new episode, 30-minute episode that drops every Monday. You can find them on hoainsights.org. You can subscribe on any of the popular podcast platforms, or they're also found on our YouTube channel. But it's all about board members, encouraging and equipping them with the hard work they do, moving their associations into the future. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will coordinate our Q&A time together today.